So welcome back. This is Canterbury Tales Intro Part 2. If you haven't watched Part 1 yet, please do so first. So here is some story context for you. You are really familiar by now with frame narratives. We have seen frame narratives over and over and over again in this class. We cannot get away from frame narratives, and this is another one. So in this context, what we have are a couple dozen travelers who are on pilgrimage to the tomb of St. Thomas Becket. So we have, I think, 28, 30 travelers, and they all meet up in an inn, and they start talking, and eventually they all decide that they are going to travel together to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. And along the way, they're telling stories, and there's a huge variety of stories. The overall structure is that there are 24 stories with a general prologue, and then each story, for the most part, gets its own little prologue that sort of stitches the frame story together around each traveler's story. Now, according to the prologue itself, it would seem that Chaucer intended for there to be about 120 stories in total. But in the surviving manuscripts that we have, we only get those 24 stories, rather than the 2 stories to the shrine, 2 stories on the way back for each character that the host character says that they're going to perform. So we don't really know for sure if Chaucer did this on purpose, if he just wrote the 24 stories and decided he was done, or if he died before he could complete all 24 stories. I personally don't have a very informed opinion on which is more likely, but it would seem to be that if he said it in the text itself that there were going to be 120 stories, and because he never wrote any kind of ending that said otherwise, I would be inclined to believe he just died before he could finish it. But it's also completely true that maybe he just got bored of writing them. I don't really have a horse in this race. But it is notable that the stories that we get are not the stories that we were promised in the story itself, in the frame narrative. Again, yeah, it seems more likely to me that he died before he could finish. But so again, a lot of the context of the story itself is this idea of expanding commerce and of a growing kind of middle class. Going on pilgrimage was actually really common. There were pilgrimage sites all over England, all over Europe, all over the kind of Catholic world at the time. And it was a really good way for people to express their religious devotion, but it was also just a really good way for people to get out and see more of the world. We have lots of records of people going on pilgrimage just as a way to go and have an excuse to see friends, or to have an excuse to go somewhere they'd never been before, or to get away from family for a while if they didn't particularly care for their families. But most often, the concept of pilgrimage travel was couched in notions of religious devotion. And even for people who had ulterior motives for traveling as well, they usually also discuss their desire to go to the shrine or resting place or sacred well or whatever it is, because they did tend to genuinely believe in the power of these places. So the story also deals heavily in the concept of the 3-estate model of the English social order, which is that society was broadly split into those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Now again, these lines were becoming a little bit blurry, especially when you think about people like Chaucer himself, who, he wasn't someone who worked, he wasn't a physical laborer, but he wasn't someone who prayed, he wasn't attached to the church, and he definitely wasn't someone who fought. So already we can see that this 3-estate model is breaking down a little bit, and he's really interrogating the ideas, or the idea of this 3-estate model in the Canterbury Tales itself. We see him playing around with notions of class distinctions, of estate distinctions, and of the implications of kind of a broadening model of what it's possible to do with your life. No longer is it just, are you going to pray, fight, or work? It's, are you going to be a diplomat? Are you going to be a merchant? Are you going to be an innkeeper? What are you going to do looks more complicated than it used to. Another important piece of context is Chaucer's criticisms of the church versus his Christian belief. He wrote fairly often about how much he admired people who were really devout in their faith, and who were just really kind of genuinely faithful people. But he also wasn't afraid to criticize various aspects of church overreach and also of kind of overindulgence. So we see criticisms, we see the narrator of the Canterbury Tales making criticisms of the church folk who are in the story pretty often. Criticizing them for being too wealthy, criticizing them for taking advantage of people, but never at any point is he critical of people's sincerely held belief. And this leads us into the last point of kind of context that you should be paying attention to, is that this story is really notable for characterization. It is probably one of the reasons why it is so well remembered 650, 700 years later is the way that it treats its characters, rather than being stock characters or stereotypes or archetypes. They are very kind of fully realized, very dynamic, round, fully fleshed out people. They feel extremely human in ways that characters don't always feel in this time period. And we'll get to more of that here in a minute. But first, we can't talk about Chaucer unless we talk about manuscripts. And this is one of my favorite things in the world. The basics of manuscript production, and this will become important, I promise, are as follows. You need a goat, a sheep, or a cow, first of all, if you're going to make parchment. Now, parchment was considered to be, in medieval Europe, sort of the standard writing material. You would write on parchment for documents, for legal documents, for most books, most prayer books, most Bibles. If you wanted to be really fancy, if you had a lot of money, or if you had something that was an especially important document, or if you were being paid a lot to produce a really fancy book, you would use vellum, which was made out of calf skin, because, calves are smaller and their skin is softer and less leathery, and really it's a horrifying process, honestly. And paper had been invented, in like 100 BC, and it was first exported out of China around 600 AD, but it didn't make its way to Europe until the 12th century via the cultural exchange around the Crusades. And so up until the 1500s, everybody just wrote on vellum and parchment all the time, if it was something that they needed to have a permanent document for, or if it was a permanent book. Now, if they were just taking notes, they would use things like wax tablets pretty often, but for anything permanent, you had to have the skin of an animal. And so because of this, the process for making these writing materials was pretty intensive, and that was one of the main reasons why books were so expensive, was because just making the material to write on took so much energy. First, you had to obviously flay the dead animal. You had to soak its skin in water first to clean it, then in a solution to get the hair off of it. Then you had to stretch it out on a rack so that you could, so that it would dry flat and it would dry very smoothly. And after that, you would take what was called a lunellum to both sides, both hair side and flesh side is what it's called, to scrape it smooth, to scrape off any imperfections, to scrape off, remaining bits of hair, of follicles, of any remaining bits of tissue on the flesh side, and to make it very thin and very, very smooth. And then finally, the smoothing process was done with things like pumice stones and chalk, just so that you actually got a perfectly smooth writing surface. So from soaking to smoothing could take an extremely long time. But it is actually this process that gives us our modern page sizes. So your standard hide would be somewhere around 18 by 24 inches. which if you cut in half, you get, an 11 by 17 piece of parchment. And if you cut that in half again, you get 8.5 by 11, which is our modern printer paper size. And if you cut that in half again, you get something that is kind of 4 by 6, 5 by 7, which you may also recognize as a common size for things like photographs, paperback books. So really, the reason why our books today are the size that they are for the most part is because that's how big a calf skin was. So think about like sheep skins as well. Those are about the same size. So yeah, the next time anybody the next time that you use a piece of printer paper, just know that printer paper is 8.5 by 11 because we used to kill calves to make vellum and write books. Moving on, here are some images of what that process looks like. In this picture, you can see he has sort of a form that he's laid the skin over. You can see a barrel in the background for soaking, and he's got a draw knife that he's using to de-hair the hair side of this skin. And in these two pictures, we see that the hide has been stretched out on a rack, racks of varying sizes, and it's being scraped smooth with the knife called a lunellum. And it's called a lunellum because it has a curved surface like the moon, like the luna. It's crescent shaped, luna, moon, you get it. So the reason why these blades were curved was because if there was any corner on them, they could catch the very, very, very tightly stretched skin and tear a hole in it. These were stretched so tightly that you could play them like drums, and that also rendered them very delicate during the processing of them for parchment. So here are some modern examples of the same thing. You can actually see the same draw knife. There's your bucket for soaking and for rinsing. He is taking the hair off of a large skin. Here's a modern lunellum. And then in this picture, you can actually see that this fellow has like a two-handed lunellum that is made for a little bit more kind of pressure and intensive work than something that might be like this, which you might consider for maybe smaller or more delicate parts of the process. Kind of a general kind of lunellum versus a finishing lunellum, maybe. So you can see in this picture that what you get when you use vellum and when it's processed really well is you do get something that looks basically just like a sheet of paper. You can see how thin it is, how delicate it is. I've had the privilege of working with some manuscripts personally, and if your vellum or your parchment is high quality, what you get is very soft to the touch, and it's very hard to tell which side was the hair side and which was the flesh side. There are ways to tell, but if your vellum has been processed well enough, you probably won't notice. So here are some of the things that can go wrong during the manuscript manufacturing process. The easiest issue is, of course, just holes tearing in the parchment or in the vellum. But even if it was a big gaping hole like this, the material was so expensive that you would sell it anyway. You would finish processing it and you would sell it anyway, because it could be cut around, or it could just be written around, or it could even be integrated into the text itself. So for example, in this manuscript, we've got a hole on this page, but whoever actually illuminated and wrote and copied this manuscript, this text, just went ahead and said, you know what, I can use this. And so they used it as a little pass-through, as a way to give the reader a preview of what was to come on the next page. So here we've got a hole, but then on the next page you can see that they've drawn a little dragon. And then another issue would be if you don't get the page really, really smooth. Here you can still see some follicles on the text. And think about this as, these are literally like pores on the skin, right? These are hair follicles. And so the scribe here has actually had to write around this section, because if you are trying to write across this, what you're going to get is the ink is going to slip into those little holes, the ink is going to run, you're not going to get a smooth copy. And that matters especially because just look how tiny this lettering is. If you're packing a lot of words onto a page, then you can't risk writing across these little bumps and divots and, ruining your page because no one can see what your letters say because they've run. The ink has run into these little divots. So that's just a little bit about the manuscript actual transcription process. And the last thing I wanted to mention was that if you look very carefully on this page, you can see some thin pencil kind of lines or score lines. And that's how scribes made sure that they were writing evenly, was that they would actually measure their page extremely carefully before they ever wrote on it. You can see that a little bit here as well, where the lines have been measured. So if you're looking at these manuscripts and going, wow, they look so good, how did anyone ever write on these? That's just because they used rulers. They didn't do any of this freehand. So when we're talking about the Canterbury Tales, there are two manuscripts that we really need to hone in on, and these are the Hengert manuscripts and the lsmir manuscripts. And the Hengert was written very shortly after Chaucer's death, and the lsmir was written a little bit later, but also just in the very early 15th century. The lsmir is often considered one of the most sort of famous or complete or kind of noteworthy medieval manuscripts, and that's because it looks amazing. So it's about 16 by 11 inches, which is what we would consider folio size. So that means, when you open it up, it is 16 by 11, which means that each page is made out of a whole skin cut in or folded in half. So it's quite a large book, and it has beautiful illuminations and illustrations, just absolutely wonderful marginalia. It includes illustrations of each of the characters that show up in the story, but it also includes an author picture. Because Chaucer uses a version of himself as a self-insert narrator, we get to see a picture of Chaucer. And that is so rare. It is so rare for us to actually not only just to have a named author, because if you recall, there are a lot of anonymous texts from this period. So not only do we have his name, we have his life story, we have a picture of him. And that's so cool. And I'm also going to post this link online as well, which is just where you can see a digitized version of the entire lsmir manuscript. But these are some of the pictures. This is the first page of the Knight's Tale. Look at all of that scroll work, look at these capitals, and then this is the knight himself on his very fancy horse with its very fancy tack. This is the Wife of Bath's intro page, which is similarly fancy and beautiful, and here she is on her horse. And then finally, here is Chaucer. Here he is, here's our man, on his little horse, pointing at his own text, in his little hat, and he just looks like kind of a normal middle-aged dude. Like, he's a little paunchy, he's got a nice little beard, he just looks like a chill, middle-aged kind of man. So it really is amazing that we have access to this. And pretty much, you will see other portraits of Chaucer floating around, but they're really just reworkings of this one. Now, the lsmir was used for a long time to produce all the popular translations and popular text versions of the Canterbury Tales because of its presumed completion and its beauty. But the person who transcribed that manuscript, the scribe for the lsmir, made really significant revisions. They also regularized the spelling of the text, and they moved around the order of the stories to try and create one smooth narrative. So the lsmir was the standard for a really long time, but today we usually recognize the Hengert as the more quote-unquote authentic text because it seems, as far as we can tell, that the transcriber of the scribe had access to Chaucer's original holograph, so, the text that Chaucer actually wrote with his own hand. So it's probably closer to his original intent. Now, if you remember, authorial intent is a dicey sort of issue. But if we are trying to recreate an actual specific text and not just like a general story, then having access to the author's original version is really valuable, and the Hengert does seem closer to that. So up next is the general prologue, and as you read, I'd like you to pay close attention to the descriptions of the pilgrims. What are they wearing? What kind of horse do they have? How are they described as their personality? What do they do for a living? And then also start to consider the ways in which Chaucer might be playing around with these ideas of social class, especially through the language that each character uses.